Hey guys, tonight we're cracking open a very quiet mystery: how the ancient Romans kept their food fresh without refrigerators, no plugs, no ice boxes, and definitely no glowing blue light when you open a door. And yet, they managed just fine, better than fine, really. They salted, they stored, they stacked clay amphorae in shady corners and hoped no one knocked them over. And you probably won't survive this. Not because it's dangerous, but because you'll be asleep long before we get past pickled onions. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Post your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're all listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in a Roman villa now, not the fancy part with mosaics and fountains, though those are nice. You're standing in the storeroom. It's cool, dim, stone-floored. The air smells faintly of herbs and damp terracotta. Somewhere nearby, someone is humming, or maybe it's just the breeze through the wall vents. This section begins beneath the surface, literally, because one of the oldest tricks in the Roman food preservation book was temperature control by architecture when you live in a warm climate. You learn early that heat is the enemy of preservation, so the Romans built low, shaded spaces to store grain, oil, fruits, and wine, not ice cold, but cool enough to buy time. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Many Roman homes and estates included cellars, storerooms celli, and partially sunken granaries, designed to moderate temperature naturally. These weren't just afterthoughts. They were part of the home's essential survival gear, like a roof or a door. In larger estates, cellars were often built beneath the kitchen or the service wing. They had thick walls, small or no windows, and limited sun exposure. Air flowed through high vents or narrow slits near the ceiling, creating a kind of natural convection system. The cooler air at floor level kept oils from going rancid and grains from sprouting. One quirky detail here: some wealthy households designed sundials or light wells into their cellar entries, not to let in light, but to avoid it. These clever cutouts would allow only a narrow beam of sunlight to touch the threshold, never reaching the food. A kind of reverse spotlight, a daily reminder that everything edible preferred the shadows. And yes, food was separated: dry goods in amphorae, fresh produce in woven baskets, dried herbs hanging overhead, just far enough from the heat of the main kitchen to avoid singeing. We also know that some towns and villas had communal storehouses, especially for grain. These buildings were lifted off the ground on stone blocks, an early form of air circulation and pest deterrent. Inside, sacks were stacked carefully with airflow in mind, nothing pressed too tightly. Space was preservation. Here comes the scholarly uncertainty. Just how effective were these architectural solutions at truly extending food life? We have archaeological evidence of storerooms. We know the dimensions, and we've even reconstructed a few, but we don't have clear data on how many extra days or weeks they added to each food's usable life. Some scholars argue these techniques were marginal at best. Others believe they were surprisingly sophisticated, especially in combination with salting, sealing, or drying. Even now, experimental archaeologists are trying it out. They build replicas of Roman storerooms and track temperature shifts across seasons. Some have placed grain in amphorae and stored them underground to see how long they stay usable. The results vary. Some foods do surprisingly well, others not so much. Still, for the average Roman family, these shady spaces weren't optional. They were critical. Even one spoiled jar of olive oil could ruin meals for weeks. One bad basket of grain mold, illness, waste. So placement mattered, temperature mattered, even how you entered the space, quickly, carefully. Closing the door behind you was part of the ritual. And perhaps it's worth noting these storerooms didn't hum, beep, or blink. They didn't need replacing every 5 years. They didn't come with warranties. They just worked, silently, steadily, with stone and shade and the hope that tomorrow's bread wouldn't be soggy. You step back into the light now, but slowly. You blink as your eyes adjust. The heat outside is sharper than you remembered. Behind you, the cellar door closes with a soft wooden thud. It's not locked, it's just done for the day. And all that food, quietly, stubbornly, remains fresh without you. You're standing in a courtyard now, just off to the side of a bustling Roman kitchen. Someone's kneading dough against a stone slab, and the faint crackle of an oil fire flutters from behind a half-drawn curtain. But your attention drifts toward the corner, where rows of clay vessels rest quietly, tucked along the shaded wall. They're not decoration, they're insulation. This section takes us into the ceramic strategies of the Roman world, the way they used earthenware not just to hold food, but to protect it, not with magic, with physics. Let's begin with the mainstream fact in ancient Rome. Food preservation wasn't just about ingredients or methods. It was also about materials, especially clay. Romans relied on a variety of ceramic vessels to extend the shelf life of oils, grains, wine, and dried goods. The most iconic among them were the amphorae, tall, narrow-necked jars used across the empire for shipping and storing everything from olive oil to salted fish. But amphora weren't just used for transport. They were deliberately designed to preserve contents as long as possible. Their narrow necks reduced exposure to air. Their thick, porous walls provided modest insulation, and most were sealed at the mouth with pitch, clay stoppers, or wax, forming a physical and sometimes airtight barrier. Some vessels, like the squat, wide-mouthed dolia, were built directly into the floor of storerooms. These enormous jars were used to store grains and dried legumes in bulk. Part of the jar remained underground, where temperatures stayed cooler. The design was simple: bury your food halfway into the earth, and let geology do the refrigeration. Now for the quirky bit, archaeologists have found amphorae with messages scratched into the clay, tiny notes from one person to another. Some were shipping instructions, some complaints too much brine, again, and others more cryptic, like one found in Ostia that simply read, "Do not open until the next moon." Whether that was a freshness suggestion or a warning, no one's entirely sure. The amphorae themselves varied in shape and size depending on the contents. Oil amphorae often had thick inner coatings to prevent seepage. Wine amphorae were sealed and stored on their sides, corked and waxed to keep oxidation low. Grain containers had wider mouths for easier scooping, but were always stored upright and dry. Elevated places, sometimes on stone pedestals shaped like mushrooms to deter rats, inside the vessels. Contents were carefully layered or suspended. Oil floated over brine. Dried figs were packed in sawdust or grape leaves. Herbs were wrapped in cloth bags and hung from pegs inside the wider vessels, away from moisture. In some cases, a thin sheet of olive oil was poured over more perishable foods, like cheese or stewed fruits, forming a fatty barrier that kept air and mold out. And now we reach the scholarly uncertainty. How widely did everyday Roman households actually use these methods? The elite certainly did. Villas had specialized storage rooms, dedicated amphorae, and servants trained in sealing and handling. But for poorer families, evidence is thinner. Some scholars argue that basic clay jugs, reused and imperfectly sealed, served the same function, though less effectively. Others suggest communal storage was more common in rural areas, with households pooling resources in larger dolia or barn-based stores. The longevity of these containers is also debated. Many amphorae were reused, patched with resin, or refired in low heat to reseal cracks. But how many cycles they could endure is unclear. Most were eventually discarded in designated dumps, one of the largest being Monte Testaccio, a man-made hill in Rome composed entirely of broken amphorae. It contains an estimated 53 million vessels. That's not a metaphor. That's just how much olive oil people went through. Back in your quiet corner of the kitchen courtyard. The sun has shifted slightly, and one amphora now glints with a warm, soft glow. You run a hand along the curved shoulder, still faintly cool to the touch. There's no label, no lid you can see, just a dab of wax over a simple clay plug and a ring of dust where it hasn't been moved in weeks. That's the genius of it. No buttons, no timers, just pottery, still doing its job. You look around, realizing how many of these vessels surround you, lined up like sentries, each one quietly working to keep something edible alive for one more day, or week, or maybe all winter, because when there's no fridge to hum in the background, the silence of clay becomes the sound of food being saved. There's a ceramic jug by your feet, the kind with the neck sealed tight, and a sticky, half-translucent crust along the rim that glints faintly in the light. You don't want to open it. You really, really don't. But someone else already did, probably last week, and the smell still lingers near the doorway like a ghost that doesn't know it's been evicted. Welcome to the curious world of garum, Rome's favorite condiment and perhaps its strangest triumph in food preservation. Garum didn't just survive without refrigeration, it thrived because of it. You'd think that fermented fish sauce, made by layering anchovies or mackerel with salt and leaving them out in the sun for weeks, would spoil into inedibility. But the Romans knew what they were doing. Under the right conditions, ample salt, sunlight, and time, fish doesn't rot. It transforms. The proteins break down into a clear, amber liquid packed with umami and salt. Think of it as soy sauce's louder Mediterranean cousin. What's remarkable isn't just that they made it, but that they relied on it. It was used in sauces, stews, soups, and even desserts. You could find it in the kitchens of wealthy villas and the stalls of roadside taverns. People poured it over everything. They even brushed it on fresh fruit. Whether that was delicious or simply unavoidable, we may never know. But garum didn't just flavor food, it preserved it too, in small quantities. It acted as a mild antimicrobial. Some households dipped cooked meat into garum before storing it in ceramic jars. Others mixed it with vinegar to make travel safe dressings. It wasn't refrigeration, but it was enough. Enough to keep things from turning too quickly. Enough to stretch food from morning to evening. A few recipes, scrawled into scraps of wax tablets or tucked into the margins of herbal texts, mention storing boiled eggs in garum for several days. The flavor, they said, deepens, which probably means don't ask questions, and yet, not every historian agrees on its ubiquity. Some argue garum was more regional, favored in port cities, but less prominent inland. Others note that elite Romans had access to higher quality variants, filtered, aged, and sealed in pitch-lined amphorae, while the poor scraped out cloudy dregs from cracked jars. There's also debate about how standardized the process really was. No two garum factories used quite the same proportions, and variations like liquamen and alec complicate the picture. Was garum always fish-based? Was it sometimes spiced? Could it be made from oysters? Or even snails, possibly? Likely. No one wrote it down in one neat scroll. Still, the evidence is everywhere. In ruined villas, they found rows of sun-blackened vats with fish scales still embedded in the plaster. In merchant records, garum shipments stretch across continents. And in Pompeii, a graffiti scrawl near a tavern door reads, "I dined well. Thank you." Garum, a sticky endorsement, perhaps, but one made in earnest. Now you crouch beside that jug again. You don't open it. You don't need to. The smell has faded into a kind of memory. Salt, sea, sun, and a little bit of alchemy. You imagine the household that made it the careful layering of fish and salt, the anxious waiting as the mixture steeped under the sky, the cautious tasting from a bent wooden ladle. You imagine them proud, or at least relieved, because in a world without fridges, keeping food edible was never guaranteed. It took knowledge, it took patience, and sometimes it took fermented fish juice you couldn't explain. A breeze moves through the courtyard. A pot clinks faintly against the stone. Someone, somewhere, is cooking, and in the corner, the garum rests, its work already done. You're walking uphill now, slowly, along a winding Roman road carved into the side of a mountain. Each step crunches against sun-bleached gravel, and in the distance, you can just make out a pair of figures bent slightly under the weight of a long-handled basket slung between them. The basket is covered in wool, dripping slightly, and if you get close enough, you'd see a faint glisten of something not quite water. Snow, not fresh, not soft, but real enough. Cut from the high slopes at dawn, packed tightly, and carried, carefully, quietly, down to a world where snow doesn't belong. This section is about a method that seems indulgent, even improbable harvesting and transporting snow in ancient Rome, in a world without electricity or compressors. Romans created coldness the hard way, by going up a mountain and bringing winter back down. The mainstream fact is this in the wealthier corners of Roman life, particularly in cities like Rome, Pompeii, and Baiae. Snow was not just a seasonal novelty. It was harvested, stored, and sometimes purchased, used to chill wine, cool dishes, and, more relevantly, to help preserve food. Roman writers mention snow mixed with straw and buried in deep. shaded pits to maintain a lower ambient temperature. Some households had dedicated snow cellars, nevarii, lined with stone and shaded by trees, where ice was packed in layers of sawdust and earth to slow the melt. Snow and ice weren't common, but they weren't mythical either. The Apennines, visible from much of central Italy, provided accessible snowbanks in winter and early spring. Wealthy families would send slaves or hired workers to collect snow in large baskets. The snow would be packed, layered with straw or cloth, and walked carefully back down to be stored before it could turn into a puddle of wasted effort. And here's the quirky detail. There are records of some households creating makeshift ice boxes by suspending clay pots filled with perishable goods over stored snow. These pots might contain figs, cheeses, or leftover roast pork, lifted just high enough above the ice to benefit from the chill, but not so close as to freeze. The technique wasn't elegant, but in the evening, when cool food was served in summer heat, no one asked questions. Seneca, never one to resist a dig, once remarked that some Romans were so obsessed with snow-cooled wine, they couldn't taste the difference between age and temperature. He meant it as a complaint, but it hints at how widespread cold storing preferences had become. The scholarly uncertainty, though, is layered. First, how often was this practice used for preservation? Versus luxury snow seems to appear more often in the context of drinks and desserts than meats and meals. Second, who had access? Some historians suggest that snow, while hard to obtain, wasn't always expensive, particularly in towns closer to mountains. Others argue that only the wealthiest households could maintain snow stores year-round, and that transporting snow was logistically extravagant. There's also some doubt about longevity. How long did snow pits last into the warmer months? How much melted en route? Experiments by historical reenactors have produced mixed results. Some say tightly packed snow in straw-filled pits can last weeks. Others say it barely survives a southern summer afternoon, but the practice itself, that part's undeniable. In fact, one villa outside of Rome was found with a dedicated room, stone-walled, heavily insulated, with a drain at the base, almost certainly used to store snow or ice. The floor was worn smooth in only one corner, suggesting a single vessel had stood there, unmoved, season after season, perhaps a wine jug, perhaps something less exciting, like turnips. And that's what makes this method so oddly touching. It wasn't fast, it wasn't easy. It involved cold hands, steep trails, and constant loss. But people did it, not to show off, not always, but to keep something fresh just a little bit longer. Back on your road now. The two figures ahead are pausing, setting down their heavy load. One uncovers a corner of the cloth to let out a puff of trapped cold air. For a moment, it lingers like breath in the summer heat. Then it vanishes. They don't linger. Snow waits for no one. You've wandered into a quieter part of the villa compound now, away from the kitchen noise and garum jars and the scent of roasting things. Here, it's cooler, shaded, dry. There's a small stone building with no windows and a heavy wooden door. It isn't locked. It doesn't need to be. The air inside does all the guarding. Inside, it smells like salt. Not like the sea, though that's somewhere in the memory, but like cured meat and packed fish and dry things that haven't moved in weeks, hanging from a crossbeam. There's a bundle of sausages tied tight with twine, their skins toughened and pale. Beneath them, thick slabs of pork, already darkening along the edges, rest on a shelf dusted in crystals. Salt, in here, is less an ingredient than an atmosphere. The Romans had no refrigeration, but they had patience and salt, and that was often enough. It wasn't just a flavor, it was a method, a strategy, a contract between time and decay. You might run a hand over one of the curing slabs now, though no one would recommend it. The meat's already stiff. The outer layer is crusted, hardened into something more armor than food. Inside, it's still transforming, not spoiling, not exactly aging either, just waiting. Cured meat wasn't rare in Rome. In fact, the empire's preservation backbone was built on salted goods, fish packed in layers with coarse salt, goat legs buried under mounds of it, even cheese rolled in brine and left to firm. The military relied on it, merchants traded it, households survived off it when gardens failed, and out on the coast, they did something even stranger, salted anchovies whole, then let them dry in the sun until they could snap like twigs. These brittle little fish, often called salsamenta, were carried in pouches and eaten like salty trail mix. Some people swore by them, others tolerated them politely. Of course, not everything worked perfectly. No one kept exact records of brining times, and methods changed from town to town. Some cooks swore by a 2-week cure. Others left things buried in salt for a full moon cycle, then smoked them just to be safe. And while salt kept things edible longer, it wasn't a miracle if the humidity spiked, or the meat was cut too thick, or the salt wasn't pure. Things turned, quietly, sometimes violently. You'd know by the smell, or the texture, or the small, growing silence around whatever used to be a ham. Still, compared to other methods, this one worked across class lines. Even small countryside homes had salt boxes. They didn't always cure whole legs, but strips of lamb or rabbit could be salted and stored over a low hearth beam in colder provinces. Some even left salted meats on outdoor shelves through the winter, trusting in wind, frost, and time. The process didn't require wealth, just knowledge and enough salt. And maybe that's what makes this little building feel important. It's not luxurious. There's no marble, no fine tools, just hooks, slabs, rope, and time. You glance down and notice a shallow trough under the shelf, discreetly placed to catch dripping brine. There's barely a drop left in it. Whatever was curing here is nearly done. Outside, a faint breeze passes through the olive trees, lifting the scent of brined air and trailing it across the path. You can almost imagine someone arriving from the market, lifting a basket of fresh figs and thinking, not what's ripe, but what will last, what won't soften by morning, what won't sour by the time guests arrive. And salt was always the answer. Not glamorous, not fast, but dependable. A safeguard that didn't need explanation or refrigeration, just time. The door to the salt house clicks softly shut behind you, and the path leads downhill now, away from stone and brine and towards something lighter. The breeze picks up a little, and so does the scent, less pungent, more herbal, like oregano crushed underfoot, or rosemary left too long in the sun. You follow it around a bend and into a long, narrow courtyard, hemmed in by faded brick and low wooden beams. Above your head, hanging from cords stretched between the rafters. There are bundles of something: fruit, meat, stalks of herbs, twisting lazily in the air. Not a marketplace, not a ceremony, just food, dangling, drying, gently resisting the passage of time. This was one of the simplest, oldest tricks in the Roman preservation book. Let the air do the work. No tools, no ice, just warmth, circulation, and patience on dry days. A breeze like this one would pull moisture from whatever hung overhead. Pear slices grew leathery. Figs shriveled down into sweetness. Strips of goat meat turned darker and tougher by the hour. It was methodical and unhurried, Rome's slowest kind of cooking. You glance up at a loop of meat, probably pork, judging by the thickness and sheen. It spins slowly in the breeze, casting a tiny moving shadow on the wall. The rope creaks just once, a chorus of drying things, each doing its own quiet work. People learned quickly that not all air drying was equal. It wasn't just about heat. The placement mattered. You needed good airflow, shade at certain hours, sunlight at others. Some homes built small upper balconies called solaria just for this. Not for lounging, though the name implies it, but for drying things too strong smelling to keep indoors. And not everything was left whole. Fruit was often sliced, meat trimmed thin. Some households even flattened fig cakes by hand and laid them over straw mats until the surface firmed like waxed cloth. A few villas got creative. There's a letter from a Roman matron complaining that her neighbor kept hanging garlic so close to our shared wall that I can taste it in my morning wine, which, if nothing else, proves the method worked. Of course, this wasn't just for summer, it was preparation for leaner seasons. Dried goods were stacked in clay jars, packed in straw, and hidden in storerooms for weeks or months. Some fruits were rehydrated in wine before use. Others, like apples or plums, were eaten hard, chewy, and sweet, no longer fresh, but more than edible. And while it all looks so intuitive, so simple, there's debate about just how much Romans relied on it. Some historians argue drying was mostly for regions with long, arid summers. Others say it was a widespread, year-round strategy that simply didn't leave much physical trace. Dried goods, after all, are eaten, mats decay, ropes fray. It's preservation that preserves nothing of itself. Even the terminology is muddy. Some sources call it arresco, others secatio. The overlap with smoking and curing techniques only blurs the lines further. Did they sun dry their meats after salting or air dry first? Then salt lightly to finish. Recipes vary. Instructions are vague, but the results remain consistent, especially in homes that couldn't afford snow or amphorae, or walls thick enough to mimic caves. For them, this was the preservation of necessity, of rope and sunlight, of turning each breeze into a tool. You sit now beneath the lowest beam and look up again. A half-dried fig drops gently to the ground beside you. Not hard, not spoiled, just ready. You leave it there because in Rome, freshness wasn't always about immediacy. Sometimes it was about survival, and sometimes it was about knowing exactly when not to eat something just yet. You're further from the villa now, past the kitchen courtyards, past the drying lines and herb gardens, out near the storage sheds where everything smells a little more like earth and smoke. The wind doesn't move as easily here. The walls are thicker. There's a faint charcoal scent in the air, not acrid, not fresh, just lingering, like someone started a fire a few hours ago and never bothered to put it out entirely. In the corner of the yard, you find it a low, squat structure made from brick and mud, its chimney barely wider than a stovepipe and already darkened from use. Inside, the walls are blackened, the roof slants inward. There's no window, just a narrow slit that lets in a thread of light, just enough to catch on a bundle of meat strung up near the rafters. It isn't cooking, it's changing. The Romans didn't smoke meat as often as they salted or dried it, but they knew how. And when they needed something to last beyond the limits of wind and sun, this was their answer, a chamber just warm enough to coax moisture out, just smoky enough to keep decay from taking hold. It wasn't a dominant preservation method, more regional, more rustic, common in the hills, in the colder provinces, in places where salt was expensive or days were too damp for good airflow. You might find it in a shepherd's hut in Gaul, or behind a tenant's farmhouse near the Alps, not in every Roman cookbook, but still, unmistakably Roman. Inside the chamber, the smell is dense but not aggressive, sweetish, resinous. They used whatever wood was available, olive branches, pine scraps, grapevine cuttings. The fire was set low, kept smoldering for hours, sometimes for a day, sometimes more, not for heat, not for flame, just for smoke. Some texts hint at this method almost sideways, a reference to meat darkened over pine or cheese left in the smoke box. One poet compares the taste of his lover's breath to smoked olives, a compliment, depending on context. We don't have many technical descriptions, just impressions, clues left in passing. One archaeological site uncovered a series of small smoke chambers in what had once been a worker's villa. The rooms were narrow, the rafters coated in soot, and there were small holes near the floor for venting heat, too deliberate to be accidental. Traces of ash, a few burned grape stems, the walls bore faint scratches, tally marks, measurements no one knows. The process didn't demand much, only time and control, and a willingness to let food rest in fire's memory instead of its heat. Some households alternated techniques: meat salted first, then hung over smoke. Others skipped the brine entirely, relying on the chamber to harden the outer layer and drive off insects. And here's where the debate starts to smolder. Was this truly preservation? Or was it flavor? Was the point to keep food through winter? Or to give it a character, the sun and salt couldn't scholars disagree. Some argue that smoking was marginal, even rare. Others point to the vast reach of the empire, Germany, Britannia, the Balkans, and say, how could they not? Rome was one thing, the empire another, and in places where the weather didn't cooperate, people adapted. They always did. You shift now on the threshold of the chamber, not stepping fully inside. The smoke has faded, but the air still holds it, and the meat above, whatever it is, turns slightly on its string as if it's listening. There's a rhythm to it, not like drying, not like salting, a slower, more deliberate transformation, almost meditative. No one stokes the fire anymore, but something is still working. You don't need to eat it to know it's ready. You've circled back toward the villa now, and a row of clay jars lines the path like sentries. Some are sealed, others are open just enough to show their contents, onions coiled tightly like sleeping snails, olives floating in brine, garlic bulbs half submerged in something golden and sharp. A few sprigs of dill rest on top, a little theatrical, but not unwelcome. Everything smells faintly acidic, a bit vinegary, but also fresh in its own assertive way. These jars weren't filled for taste alone. They were filled because time is unkind, and pickling was a way to push back. Preservation by pickling wasn't flashy in ancient Rome, but it was common, practical, reliable, and favored by those who wanted their food to survive travel, winter, or an unexpected visit from someone who brought 6 hungry cousins. You lift the lid off a smaller jar and peer inside. It's packed tightly with green olives, their surfaces wrinkled from time, submerged in a cloudy liquid that smells of vinegar, salt, and faintly of crushed bay leaves. You know, instinctively, that the olives are fine, that they were picked weeks ago, maybe months, and that the liquid around them has done its work. Pickling wasn't reserved for one class or region. You'd find it in coastal towns, where fish and seaweed went into brine before being hauled inland. You'd find it in rural kitchens, where mushrooms were soaked in vinegar and oil and packed into stone pots for late autumn use. And you'd find it in army camps, where vegetables were steeped in sharp solutions and carried for weeks without spoiling. Some Romans added spices, mustard seed, coriander, bits of dried fig. Others kept things plain. What mattered was the liquid salty, sour, acidic enough to make spoilage hesitate, a kind of edible pause button. You step past another row of jars, noticing how each one is marked, not with labels, but with patterns scratched into the clay. A crosshatch, a swirl, a single thumbprint pressed near the rim. It's a quiet language, one meant to tell the difference between onions and shallots, or between quick pickled things and jars meant to sit for months. There's a recipe in a surviving Roman text that describes storing young leeks in old vinegar and a whisper of honey. It claims they'll sing on the tongue after 10 days. No one knows what that means, but people have been trying to replicate it ever since. And there's something even more curious in the records, a small line in a merchant's log from the port of Ostia describing pickled fruit shipped across the sea plums, preserved in sour wine and spices, to be opened after the equinox. Whether this was medicine or luxury, no one agrees. But someone trusted the jar enough to write it down. Scholars still debate how widespread the technique truly was. Some argue pickling was mostly seasonal, a harvest strategy more than a preservation one. Others insist it was constant, a year-round rhythm of bottling, steeping, sealing, and waiting. The lack of standard recipes makes it hard to pin down. What remains are fragments, notes in margins, brine-stained pots, and poems that compare lovers' lips to vinegar-soaked grapes. You crouch now beside the last jar and run your fingers along the seal. It's made from wax and something thicker, clay, perhaps, or compressed ash. It's been painted with a bit of red ochre, not to decorate, to warn. This one's not ready, not yet. That's the secret to pickling. It's not just about keeping food safe. It's about timing, about patience, about knowing when not to eat something, so that later, when the world is leaner or colder or more uncertain, you can open a jar and find something still alive inside. You don't open it, you just listen to the air trapped inside the clay. It says nothing, but you know it's waiting. Somewhere deeper in the villa's main quarters, past a set of heavy linen curtains and down a quiet hallway. There's a storeroom that doesn't smell like vinegar or brine or smoke. It smells sweet, not like fruit, but like something richer, syrupy, a little burnt, a little strange. A small clay bowl rests on a wooden shelf, covered in linen. You lift the cloth and find what looks like a wedge of cheese, but darker, glossy, amber at the edges. A thin crust of something golden glistens over its surface. You don't touch it, but you smell it. Honey. The Romans understood that honey wasn't just food, it was protection. It sealed, preserved, insulated. It was a one ingredient defense against decay, sweetness with an agenda. They used honey on everything: fruit, cheese, cakes, even meat, especially meat that had already been cooked. A roast pheasant, say, basted lightly in honey, then cooled and sealed in a clay pot. A bit more honey poured over the top, hardened into a crust. No air, no spoilage. The result, a kind of edible time capsule. You cracked it open a week later, and the meat was still soft, still fragrant, still astonishing. One recipe from Apicius describes layering figs in a jar, pouring in honey until they floated, then weighting them down with a clean stone, not for fermentation, not for flavor, just to hold them in place. The stone made sure the figs stayed fully submerged, safe beneath their amber ceiling. But honey had the other uses too. Cheese wheels were rubbed with it, forming a sticky rind. Sometimes, dates were packed in layers of honey, clay sealed, and taken on long journeys, snack and preservative in one. There's even mention of storing rose petals in honey to make perfumed syrup, though whether that preserved anything or was just poetic excess is unclear. What makes this fascinating, maybe even funny, is how little credit honey got as a preservative in Roman writings. It's rarely listed as a technique, just mentioned offhand. Like, of course, you would pour honey over things. Why wouldn't you? It's sweet. It's beautiful. It doesn't spoil. It makes things last. And yet scholars still debate whether these methods were widespread or luxurious. Was honey common enough to preserve meat routinely, or was it a mark of wealth, a kind of edible vanity only affordable in villas like this one? Beekeeping was common in the empire, but yields varied. A modest estate might collect enough honey for sauces, maybe desserts, but sealing entire roasts. That's where opinion diverges. There's archaeological evidence, traces of hardened sugars found inside cooking vessels, residue that tests positive for beeswax and floral pollens. But interpretation is slippery. Were these from preservation efforts, or just remnants of honey-sweetened sauces cooked too long over low fires? And then there's the quietest mystery of all: did people use honey like this, knowing it preserved food, or just because it tasted good, maybe it didn't matter? Maybe it was both. Maybe sweetness was just another form of security. You step carefully back from the shelf now, letting the cloth fall over the bowl. The scent lingers, warm and oddly calming, not like a meal, like a memory, outside. The light has faded just slightly. A long shadow crosses the stone threshold. Someone once said that the smell of honey in a closed room keeps sadness from settling. You don't know if that's true, but you don't feel sad here. You feel still. There's a courtyard in the back of the villa, quiet and oddly sour smelling. The kind of scent that clings to your nostrils, not unpleasant, but sharp enough to suggest that something here isn't just sitting, it's changing. In one corner, a row of ceramic vats lines the wall, low and wide, their rims stained with something brownish pink. You lean in, slowly, vinegar. Not wine gone wrong, but wine gone purposeful. Romans didn't throw spoiled things away, they repurposed them. And vinegar, sharp, acidic, alive, was one of their sharpest tools for keeping food from turning. They used it like a line in the sand. You could almost hear the logic if the meat starts to fade. Dip it in vinegar. If the water seems suspect, splash a little in. If the vegetables are too raw, too soft, too eager to rot, give them a bath in sourness. Some kitchens had dedicated vinegar pots set aside for nothing but this, always slightly sticky, always open to the air, always buzzing faintly with the memory of fermentation. And they didn't stop at the kitchen. In the military, vinegar was mixed with water to make posca, a sour drink that was safer to consume than river water and lasted longer in leather skins. You run your hand along one of the jars. The clay is rough, unglazed. A fly buzzes past, unimpressed, inside. The surface of the liquid is calm, but just beneath it, something is working, a living acidity, an invisible line between fresh and not. There's a recorded recipe for preserving radishes in old vinegar steeped with dill and garlic, left to rest in a sealed pot for 4 days. The result, not crisp, not soft, something in between, eaten with salted fish and hard cheese. A poor man's lunch, maybe, but one that held its shape long after the harvest ended. And what's more curious is how vinegar wasn't just used for vegetables or meat. Some households rinsed fruit in diluted vinegar, especially in warmer climates, to slow the bloom of mold. Apples, pears, even grapes, just a light wash. Then a spot in a cool room. It didn't stop time, but it slowed it. Not everyone agreed on how strong the solution should be. Some cooks insisted on thick, almost tar-like vinegar, reduced down from strong wines. Others swore by a thinner, younger vinegar, arguing that heavy acids masked flavor. The debate lives on in modern kitchens. But back then, no one was asking which vinegar was better for taste. They were asking which one made bread last longer when dipped, which one kept the pickled garlic from softening, which one made goat's cheese bite just a bit more sharply on the second day. You shift your weight, crouch near a smaller pot set aside from the others. There's a faint design etched into its surface, a triangle, a spiral, a line, not decorative, a reminder, maybe. This one's older, stronger. Don't open unless you mean it. Some scholars argue that the use of vinegar in preservation wasn't consistent across the empire, that it was popular in southern provinces, but less so in colder ones. Others believe its versatility, cleaning, seasoning, curing, made it a staple even in modest homes. The truth may sit somewhere in between, like so many Roman habits, half practical, half instinctive, always shifting with the weather, the region, the cook. But what's certain is that vinegar offered a kind of control, not complete, not permanent, but just enough. Enough to make yesterday's food edible tomorrow, enough to turn uncertainty into sour certainty. You stand again. The breeze lifts the hem of your tunic. Somewhere behind you, someone is crushing grapes, not for wine, this time, but for the vinegar that will follow. Because even when things go bad, Rome had a way to use them. The air near the storeroom has grown quieter now, not just from fading light, but from the way sound behaves around certain kinds of carefulness. You've entered a room that seems half filled with earth and half with intention. There's no decoration here, no amphorae stacked in pride, just low shelves, bins packed with fine ash, and a series of earthen troughs that look more like garden boxes than anything edible. But they're not for planting, they're for waiting. At first glance, you wouldn't guess this room has anything to do with food, but tucked gently in the bins are eggs, not dozens, not piled, but placed, each one partly buried in soft gray ash or dampened sand, a method so unassuming. It hardly looks like a method at all. This was one of Rome's quieter tricks, keeping eggs fresh not by cooling them, but by shielding them. The idea wasn't to halt decay, but to stall its signals, keep out the air, keep in the moisture, let time walk slower. Some households used fine clay slurry for this, coating each egg in a thin layer, then storing them in straw. Others favored a brining mixture, though that left the eggs changed, firmer, a little pickled, but the simplest approach, and perhaps the oldest, was the one you're seeing now, eggs in ash, turned once a week when it's left untouched otherwise. A few writers of the time mention it in passing. Eggs, preserved in gray matter, keep for many days. One farm manual notes, that's it. No ratios, no warnings. Just the confidence of someone who'd done it often enough to stop explaining. It's easy to imagine the daily ritual: reach into the ash, turn each egg, listen for the sound they make when gently tapped. The hollow ones are gone, the soft ones discarded. The rest stay, unchanged, useful. There's something humbling about it, really. This preservation method doesn't need temperature, doesn't need a storeroom blessed by mountain snow or a fortune in salt. It just needs patience, and material most people had too much of anyway. Ash from cooking fires, sand from the yard, clay from the side of the road. The scholarly debate here is oddly quiet. Some argue this method was a rare curiosity, only used in times of shortage. Others say it was widespread among rural estates, so basic it escaped written documentation. And because eggs leave no bones and ash rarely makes records, the archaeology says little. What we do have are surviving Roman farm texts, many passed through monastic hands, which treat this method not as innovation, but as habit. You kneel beside one of the troughs. The ash is soft, cooler than the air, faintly scented with whatever wood it came from. You uncover one egg, then gently rebury it. You're not testing anything, you're just following the rhythm. There's something deeply Roman about that. Preservation as a practice not of chemistry, but of care, not to dazzle, and just to sustain, not forever, just long enough to get through. And in a world where meals depend on the sun, the stream, the schedule of hens, a stored egg is not small. It's security, quiet, ovoid certainty outside. Someone rings a small brass bell for evening wash, but in here, nothing rushes, nothing spoils, nothing demands attention. The eggs keep waiting, and that, for now, is enough. The kitchen is nearly empty now, its hearth low, the copper pots cooling slowly against the wall, but tucked near the oven, you spot a rounded dome of coarse dough, cracked and browned, sitting on a flat tile. It isn't dinner. It isn't bread, at least. Not bread you'd eat. This is something else entirely. You step closer. A faint scent rises, dry, toasty, yeasty, but hollow. There's no softness inside, just space, and tucked within that space, a smaller bundle of actual bread, wrapped in linen and baked inside this protective shell. This was one of the stranger Roman techniques, preserving moisture by hiding it inside something already dry. Call it edible insulation, or perhaps edible deception. In a world without plastic or foil, keeping a loaf fresh was less about wrapping and more about concealing. Roman bakers would sometimes take a finished bread, a softer one, usually made with honey or milk, and encase it in a second layer of coarse, waterless dough. This outer shell wasn't meant to be eaten. It was a barrier, a shield against air, heat, and time. Once baked, the whole package could be stored for days when cracked open. The inner bread was still soft, steamed gently by its own trapped moisture. Travelers sometimes carried these loaves across days of dusty road, breaking into them like unwrapping a secret. Some cooks did the same trick with clay pots instead of dough, sealing lids with strips of dough that hardened during baking. The bread inside wasn't necessarily better, just preserved, hidden from the dry air, from insects, from change. It sounds clever now. It probably sounded even more clever when someone first stumbled into the idea centuries before, perhaps by forgetting to remove a lump of starter dough from the oven, and finding the inside unexpectedly warm and safe. There's a recipe fragment, attributed to a kitchen slave named Soda, that says simply, wrap sweetbread in mother's crust. Bake until it forgets the outside. It isn't poetry, but it comes close. This method didn't become universal. Some scholars believe it was a regional habit, passed along by specific baking guilds or used for festival breads. Others think it was mostly for travel food, loaves baked for journeys, then cracked open at campsites or roadside shrines. The lack of consistent documentation suggests it wasn't everyday practice, but it was known, and the few surviving loaves found at Herculaneum and Pompeii, even carbonized, show signs of double layers. Some even seem to have been scored deliberately, as if to help the outer shell break cleanly when struck. You crouch beside the tile and tap the crust with one finger. It sounds hollow. It's meant to be. You imagine peeling it open and finding a soft, honeyed roll within, still springy, still fragrant, protected by the thing most people would throw away. A fringe detail some wealthier homes would carve family initials or symbols into the outer shell, not for branding, but to mark the bread's owner if it were shared in communal ovens. One archaeologist noted the faint outline of a vine leaf pressed into a fragment of outer dough. The bakery, she said, was shared by 4 households. The leaf was one family's way of saying, "This one's ours." You stand again, leaving the shell intact. It's already done what it was meant to, and in the growing quiet of the kitchen, there's something reassuring about its simplicity, a protective gesture, a practical magic, not to make bread last forever, just long enough to be remembered. Beyond the storerooms, past the kitchen, there's a smaller chamber that seems unrelated to food entirely. The floor is swept clean, the shelves are mostly bare, and a single oil lamp flickers quietly in the corner. But if you look closely, nestled between a jar of dried laurel leaves and a chipped bowl filled with bay salt, there's something odd. A carved wooden figurine standing upright beside a tiny folded cloth. This is no pantry item, but it still has everything to do with food. In many Roman homes, especially rural ones, food preservation wasn't only a matter of jars and fire and ash, it was also spiritual, symbolic, a kind of quiet reverence toward the idea that food should not be wasted, spoiled, or lost. That preservation was not just a technique, but a responsibility. This was where household shrines came in, and not just any shrines. These were often dedicated to the lares and penates, the spirits of the home and the pantry. They didn't demand offerings in temples. They asked for respect in the kitchen, tucked into corners, painted into walls, carved into beams. The images of these spirits stood guard over supplies, not to stop decay, but to bless vigilance. In some households, small tokens were left near stored goods, a pinch of salt, a circle of dough, or a strip of cloth tied around a jar handle. Not superstition, just habit. One layer of protection more. Some of these gestures feel small, like laying an olive pit beside a sealed wine amphora to remember the grove. Others were more elaborate dried herbs, hung not just for use, but as offerings, wrapped in red string and replaced with each change of season. In wealthier homes, inscriptions above storerooms sometimes invoked Vesta, goddess of the hearth, to breathe warmth into what must last. There's little agreement among scholars about how widespread these customs truly were. Some treat them as symbolic rituals, rare and practiced only in devout households. Others believe they were nearly universal, passed down through generations like recipes, folded into daily rhythms. The problem is, shrines don't preserve well. They were often made of soft clay or paint, tucked into wood. What's left now are hints of footprint on a shelf, a pattern of smoke on a wall, the ghost of a figure once drawn with ochre, and yet the presence lingers. One figurine, found buried beneath a granary floor near Ostia, bore an inscription scratched so faintly into the base that it went unnoticed for decades. It read, simply stay. No threats, no theology, just an instruction to the food, perhaps, or to the god, or to time itself. Back in the villa, you run your fingers across the shelf beside the little wooden figure. The air here feels different, not colder, not warmer, just paused, as if something expects you to stand still for a moment and acknowledge the work being done in silence. There's a line from a rural Roman farmer's journal, translated centuries later by a monk: we salt the meat, we smoke the fish, and still we pray. Because even when the amphora is sealed and the fire has gone out and the jars are lined in rows, there's always one last gesture to make. A nod, a word, a presence, and it doesn't matter whether you believe the bread lasts longer because of the charm or because of the salt. What matters is that you made the effort to preserve what you've gathered, to keep what you've made alive just a little longer. You're standing now near the rear gate of the estate, where wagons once rolled in and out, bearing baskets and jars and crates roped shut with waxed string. The kitchen is behind you. The storerooms are silent. But here, on the open threshold between home and distance, is where preservation changed. Because keeping food fresh wasn't always about waiting. It was often about moving. Rome was a hungry empire, and its food had to travel over roads, rivers, and seas. Preservation wasn't just a matter of time, it was also a matter of motion. And the further the food went, the smarter the containers had to be on the ground beside you. The remnants of that thinking still sit a set of broad-bottomed amphorae, coated with pitch along their interiors, and resting inside small, straw-lined baskets that once fit snug into the bed of a cart. One still carries the faint smell of olive oil and sea air. Another, sharper, probably garum. There's a lid nearby, crusted with wax, and a single pressed seal, a crescent shape with a dot in the middle, a merchant's mark. Inside these jars once sat goods not meant for display, but for endurance. Grain coated in charcoal dust to deter insects, dates packed in compressed leaves, wine diluted, sealed, then tucked inside larger jars filled with sawdust. Each technique, less about flavor than longevity. They used what they had: sand, ash, grape skins, straw, sometimes dried herbs layered like insulation, sometimes salt. Always something that filled the space between the food and its fate. And travel was risky. Rome's roads were long, its sea routes unpredictable. Every shipment was a gamble against weather, jostling, and time. So merchants hedged their bets. Some buried small jars of pickled garlic inside larger crates of flour, trusting the dry grain to keep the jars cool. Others slathered cheeses in clay, then packed them in hay. Not all of it worked, but enough did. There's a surviving note from a shipping manifest in Alexandria listing 10 amphorae of salted lemons, one with cracked lip, discarded at port. No drama, no panic, just part of the process. Scholars argue about how consistent these methods were. Some claim that standardized packing methods were taught by merchant guilds, passed down like trade secrets. Others suggest it was looser, more trial and error, more regional wisdom than institutional memory. One thing's clear by the late Empire: food from across 3 continents reached Roman tables with alarming regularity. And this wasn't just for elites. Roman soldiers received regular rations, often of preserved or travel-hardened food. The army's logistics depended on preservation by transport, just as much as it did on salt or vinegar. A soldier in Gaul might eat olives from Hispania, biscuits baked in Campania, and fish from the Adriatic, all in 1 week. None of it fresh, was all of it edible. You crouch by the nearest basket and tug at a remaining strap of cloth, frayed, but still knotted. There's a moment of recognition here, not of flavor, not of recipe, but of intention. Someone packed this not for now, but for later. Someone tried to cheat time, just enough to get this food from there to here, and now the gate ahead is open. The path beyond is quiet. No oxen clatter, no merchants shout. But the marks are still there, grooves in the stone, worn by wheels that carried food not just across space, but across spoilage. You don't need to taste anything to know what it meant. What mattered wasn't the journey, it was the arrival, with something still worth eating. The storerooms are closed now. The fire has gone down to coals, somewhere in the distance. A gate clicks shut for the last time today. You remain, not for any task, not for any reason, but because there's something almost too gentle to leave behind just yet. You wander slowly through the last hallway of the villa, feet light on stone, fingertips grazing clay jars, wicker baskets, and smooth wood worn by repetition. This final room isn't really a room. It's more of an alcove, tucked between the kitchen and the sleeping quarters, where leftover warmth gathers and silence holds steady. A few shelves, a small amphora, uncorked, a soft cloth draped over a folded stack of bread loaves. One is slightly misshapen. One is marked with the curve of a thumb. This is where the preserved things rest, not proudly, not in abundance, but patiently. Olives steeped in wine vinegar, a wedge of cheese sealed under honey, a date cake, slightly cracked. These are the items that have made it. Not luxurious, not urgent, just still good, still here. You sit for a moment on a low stool, knees pulled in. There's a smell in the air, hard to name. A little salt, a little smoke, a little flour. It's the smell of food not yet eaten, but not forgotten either. A shelf hum, a pantry stillness, a held breath. There's no one explaining anything, no voice telling you when things were packed, or how long they've lasted, or which clever method kept them from turning. Just the quiet evidence that someone cared, that someone learned how to make food stay. You think of the pickles, the salted meats, the snow-cooled wines, the drying herbs, the eggs in ash. Each one a soft resistance, each one a promise that tomorrow doesn't have to begin with scarcity, that the world can hold something for you until you're ready for it. You exhale, and now we wind down. Let the shelves fade, let the jars lose their labels, let the smoke of the kitchen become a blur. You're not in the villa anymore, not exactly. You're drifting somewhere between amphora and dream, between the scent of honey and the click of a cellar door. You don't need to know how long the food will last. You don't even need to know what time it is. The last fig is still resting. The vinegar is sealed. The salt has done its work. And you don't have to carry anything now, not even memory. Just the weightless knowledge that something sweet still waits in the dark. So rest. Let the thoughts go brittle. Let them hang like herbs in the air. You are safe. You are fed. You are still. And so is the world around you. Good night.